Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. Read for you by the author.
Almost a decade has passed since this book was first published. For the first time in many years, I've pulled out a copy and read a few chapters to see how much my voice may have changed over time. I confess to wincing ever so often at a poorly chosen word, a mangled sentence, an expression of emotion that seems indulgent or overly practiced. But I cannot honestly say that the voice in this book is not mine, that I would tell the story much differently today than I did 10 years ago, even if certain passages have proven to be inconvenient politically. On September 11th, 2001, the world fractured. The planes, like specters, vanishing into steel and glass, the slow-motion cascade of towers crumbling into themselves, the ash-covered figures wandering the streets, the anguish and the fear. What I do know is that history returned that day with a vengeance, that in fact, as Faulkner reminds us, the past is never dead and buried. It isn't even past. This collective history, this past, directly touches my own, not merely because the bombs of Al-Qaeda have marked, with an eerie precision, some of the landscapes of my life, but also because the underlying struggle between worlds of plenty and worlds of want, between the modern and the ancient, between those who embrace our irksome diversity while still insisting on a set of values that binds us together, and those who would seek, under whatever flag or slogan or sacred text, a certainty and simplification that justifies cruelty toward those not like us, is the struggle set forth on a miniature scale in this book. Dreams from My Father. At the time of his death, my father remained a myth to me, both more and less than a man. He had left Hawaii back in 1963 when I was just 2, so that as a child I knew him only through the stories that my mother and grandparents told. My grandfather would shake his head. "Now there's something you can learn from your dad," he would tell me. "Confidence, the secret to a man's success." At the point where my own memories begin, my mother had already begun a courtship with the man who would become her second husband, and I sensed, without explanation, why the photographs had to be stored away. The few photographs of my father that remained in the house, old black and white studio prints. Miscegenation. In 1960, the year that my parents were married, miscegenation still described a felony in over half the states in the Union. In many parts of the South, my father could have been strung up from a tree for merely looking at my mother the wrong way. In the most sophisticated of northern cities, the hostile stares, the whispers, might have driven a woman in my mother's predicament into a back-alley abortion. The fact that my grandparents had answered yes to this question, no matter how grudgingly, remains an enduring puzzle to me. There was nothing in their background to predict such a response, no New England transcendentalists or wild-eyed socialists in their family tree. True, Kansas had fought on the Union side of the Civil War. Gramps liked to remind me that various strands of the family contained ardent abolitionists. If asked, Toot would turn her head in profile to show off her beaked nose, which, along with a pair of jet-black eyes, was offered as proof of Cherokee blood. But an old sepia-tone photograph on the bookshelf spoke most eloquently of their roots. It showed Toot's grandparents, of Scottish and English stock, standing in front of a ramshackle homestead, unsmiling and dressed in coarse wool, their eyes squinting at the sun-baked, flinty life that stretched out before them. Theirs were the faces of American Gothic, the Wasp bloodline's poorer cousins, and in their eyes one could see the truth that I would have to learn later as facts, that Kansas had entered the Union free only after a violent precursor to the Civil War. So you had to listen carefully to recognize the subtle hierarchies and unspoken codes that had policed their early lives, the distinctions of people who don't have a lot and live in the middle of nowhere. It had to do with something called respectability. There were respectable people and not so respectable people, and although you didn't have to be rich to be respectable, you sure had to work harder at it if you weren't. There was only one problem. My father was missing, and nothing that my mother or grandparents could tell me could obviate that single unassailable fact. Their stories didn't tell me why he had left. They couldn't describe what it might have been like had he stayed. Like the janitor, Mr. Reed, or the black girl who churned up dust as she raced down a Texas road, my father became a prop in someone else's narrative. The fact that Caucasians in Hawaii are occasionally at the receiving end of prejudice. One thing other nations can learn from Hawaii, he says, is the willingness of races to work together towards common development. I was too young to realize that I was supposed to have a live-in father, just as I was too young to know that I needed a race. Most of the books held little interest for a 9-year-old boy, but in one corner I found a collection of Life magazines. Eventually I came across a photograph of an older man in dark glasses and a raincoat. I now saw that the man's crinkly hair, his heavy lips and broad, fleshy nose, all had this same uneven, ghostly hue. The man had received a chemical treatment, the article explained, to lighten his complexion. He had paid for it with his own money. He expressed some regret about trying to pass himself off as a white man, and was sorry about how badly things had turned out. But the results were irreversible. There were thousands of people like him, black men and women back in America, who'd undergone the same treatment in response to advertisements that promised happiness as a white person. I felt my face and neck get hot. My stomach knotted. The type began to blur on the page. Did my mother know about this? I had a desperate urge to jump out of my seat, to show them what I had learned, to demand some explanation or assurance. I was already enrolled in a nearby school, and the relatives were anxious to meet us. There wasn't much light left, but we took a short walk down the mud path into the village. Groups of giggling neighborhood children waved from their compounds, and a few barefoot old men came up to shake our hands. We stopped at the common, where one of Lolo's men was grazing a few goats, and a small boy came up beside me holding a dragonfly that hovered at the end of a string. When we returned to the house, the man who had carried our luggage was standing in the backyard with a rust-colored hen tucked under his arm and a long knife in his right hand. He said something to Lolo, who nodded, and called over to my mother and me. My mother told me to wait where I was and sent Lolo a questioning glance. "Don't you think he's a little young?" my mother said. Lolo shrugged and looked down at me. "The boy should know where his dinner is coming from. What do you think, Barry?" I looked at my mother, then turned back to face the man holding the chicken. Lolo nodded again, and I watched the man set the bird down, pinning it gently under one knee and pulling its neck out across a narrow gutter. For a moment the bird struggled, beating its wings hard against the ground, a few feathers dancing up with the wind. Then it grew completely still. The man pulled the blade across the bird's neck in a single smooth motion. Blood shot out in a long crimson ribbon. The man stood up, holding the bird far away from his body, and suddenly tossed it into the air. It landed with a thud, then struggled to its feet, its head lolling grotesquely against its side, its legs pumping wildly in a wide, wobbly circle. I watched as the circle grew smaller, the blood trickling down to a gurgle, until finally the bird collapsed, lifeless on the grass. Lolo rubbed his hand across my head and told me and my mother to go wash up before dinner. The three of us ate quietly, under a dim yellow bulb, chicken stew and rice, and then a dessert of red, hairy-skinned fruit so sweet at the center that only a stomachache could make me stop. Later, lying alone beneath a mosquito net canopy, I listened to crickets chirp under the moonlight and remembered the last twitch of life that I'd witnessed a few hours before. I could barely believe my good fortune. Like many Indonesians, Lolo followed a brand of Islam that could make room for the remnants of more ancient, animist, and Hindu faiths. He explained that a man took on the powers of whatever he ate. One day soon, he promised, he would bring home a piece of tiger meat for us to share. We weren't living in the Jim Crow South, I would remind him. We weren't consigned to some heatless housing project in Harlem or the Bronx. We were in goddamn Hawaii. We said what we pleased, ate where we pleased, we sat in the front of the proverbial bus. None of our white friends, guys like Jeff or Scott from the basketball team, treated us any differently than they treated each other. They loved us and we loved them back. Seemed like half of them wanted to be black themselves. Or at least Dr. J. Well, that's true, Ray would admit. Maybe we could afford to give the badass nigger pose a rest. Save it for when we really needed it. And Ray would shake his head. A pose, huh? Speak for your own self. And I would know that Ray had flashed his trump card, one that, to his credit, he rarely played. I was different, after all, potentially suspect. I had no idea who my own self was. Unwilling to risk exposure, I would quickly retreat to safer ground.